Hello friends, welcome to the channel riddleconnect.com, and in this session we will discuss the React.js tutorials, the latest version hooks introduced in React 18.0, and the hook we discuss in this session is use ID. Okay, so this is the stable use ID hook which is introduced in 18th version of React on 29th of March 2022 this year. Okay, so we will discuss in deep. Okay, so before going to discuss the use ID, basically why use ID was introduced? Does any similar thing was there in before the use ID hook? So the answer is that yes, we were have this method there inside the React unstable use opaque identifier. Okay, so this was the unique identifier provider which were introduced earlier before the 18th, and this was in unstable stage because there were many much issues, okay, in this method. So it was in unstable state, so somehow you can use that one in earlier versions like 18 17 16. Okay, so but from 18 onwards we will have to use id hook to get the unique id. Okay, so what basically unique ID do? Basically, this unstable opaque identifier provides a unique ID so that you can use this ID whenever it is required to get some ID for individual elements or in loop. If you are binding some input tag in loop and you want to provide some ID dynamically for the input elements. Okay, so at that time you will need some unique identifier. Okay. So, with the help of this unstable use opaque identifier, we have also created the same some form, and you can see that we have the full name as ID here. We have set it the ID to the input full name, and similarly for the label, we have used this ID HTML4. Okay. Similarly for we have mail and for terms. So we have three different ID, unique ID for this form. So if you will right click on this form, you will see the ID R colon 0. That means R for React, and colon separator is there and 0 is the index. So for the second one you will get the index as 1. Okay, so this is the unique identifier, and the third one is the checkbox. So if you will check with checkbox, so this is the R2. So this was the unique identifier earlier before user ID hook. Okay, now we will see the example with the help of user ID for 18th version of React. Okay, so here is the example of that. So we have multiple examples, example 1, example 2 up to 5 for using the hook called use ID. So you can see that we are importing this use ID and also the version. So we have binded the version. You can see it is the 18.1.0. Okay. Now you can see we simply call the use ID hook and we will get the IDs here. Okay, the same form is there for first one. You can see. Okay. So if you will inspect with this input, so you can see there is some difference in the format of unique identifier earlier format. Okay, so there is no separator between R and the number. The separator is before R and the separator is before at the end. Okay, so that React will easily identify that it is the user ID generated by the hook. Okay. Similarly, if you will go for the another one, you can see the R4 colon R4 colon. Okay. For checkbox colon R5 colon. Okay. So there are multiple scenarios where you can use this huge ID. So we have the example one. Okay, here. Now we will go for the example two. See, we are using the ID as a prefix. Okay, so you can see that we have a prefix as use ID, and then after we have a static full name. Okay, so for example two, if you will inspect this thing, so you can easily see that it is maintaining the count as well. That means if your page have multiple unique ID, then you will also get the unique ID. So the increment is right now 9 with the full name as a static one. Prefix 2 with email, prefix 3, and okay. So you can easily use as a prefix. Now we will see the third example. The third example is the binding of data in map. So here you can see you can give the separate ID to the p tag with the help as a prefix. One thing you have to notice that the React has warned that you have not to use this use ID as a key. So the key ID will be your on record ID, not the use ID. Okay, so this is the warning which has already provided by the React on its official page. Okay. Now example 4, we have an ID type, type of ID. Okay, so this is the written ID is RF. Okay, and the type of ID is string, so that you know that the use ID returns the string value. Okay, that means the type of ID is string. Okay, now we will go for example 5. We have a user ID with 5 as initial. Okay, so in console, is there any console here? Nothing console. So you can also see there is warning for the 18th version that 100 through date root is depreciated. Okay, so this is the warning from the 18th version. Okay, so the last one is that if you will, okay, so you have started with 5, it doesn't change that, it only gives after F you will get the H. Okay, so this is the example of use ID. Okay, in this session we have discussed the use ID hook, and in which was introduced in 18th version of React. But before that we have the unstable method called use opaque identifier, which gives the same as unique ID, but it has some drawbacks, or there were some issues. So the format is changed. Earlier format was R colon the counter followed by counter, and the current ID we are using the colon R, then incremental, then colon. Okay, so this is the basic difference between both of them. So in this session we have this much, and in the next session we will discuss more on the new hooks arrived in 18th version of React. So stay tuned and like this video, subscribe our channel, share this video. Thanks for watching.